Miss Jody here with another video for biology. So we're continuing on. Like I said in my last video, I do want to finish the chapters that go along with the first level biology, which would normally be studying all the basics of the processes and cell, cytology, all that stuff that we went through, ecology, and then the classification groups as a whole. So I do want to get all the way through that. This last part of the book, of the last like 4 chapters, I think 4 or 5 chapters, are all on the human anatomy and physiology side after we study mammals. And I'm going to just leave those for you to complete on your own. We will have still completed our requirements for a high school credit, which is 75% of the textbook along with all the tests and the exams. Now the test, I have been keeping them going, and I've just been putting blank ones in your journals. And when you get your journal, you can use those blank ones to practice before you try to take the exam, which I will eventually attach when we're done here with our chapters. We have a couple more, but the blank test you can use, do some studying at home, and then try to take the quizzes. I think it's from quiz, trying to think which chapter, because all mine are blank most of the time anyway, so I don't know which ones we were. I think when we started, when we got separated, I think we started with, we were on Kingdom Plantae. So I think it was, we had already done the first couple sets of classification with archaea and bacteria and chromista and the protozoans. So I think we've done all the tests in class for those. I think it's just from Plantae on. So I have been putting them in your book so that way they're there, and then you can use your book at home since we're not having these times of review and stuff that we normally do before we take our test. So that way you can study up and challenge yourself to see how much you remember for those little quizzes that go in the journals, because the quizzes in the journals are just ways to keep us accountable and make sure that we're working hard to study these concepts. And these concepts in this book are pretty detailed, and I do really love it. But I realize, after teaching biology for so many years, this new book, it threw me off a little bit because there was so much stuff to study, and it went in a little more in depth than than the Apologia book in some areas. So next year, hopefully I'll do a little bit better with getting a little farther along. But either way, we have completed together at least 75% of the book, along with hopefully you've been completing your hours at home too for your hour part of getting the high school credit. All right, so we have the arthropods we're starting. So a couple weeks ago, we finally got into Kingdom Animalia, if you remember, and we had the classifications of what it means to be considered a animal. I should say, not classification, characteristics. And then we talked about how then Kingdom Animalia is going to be classified. And so then we did some little notes on some of the categories, starting with the invertebrates. So we did the Porophora, the sponges, and we talked about those, the Cnidarians, the stinging cell group, if you remember, and then we went into the general group called the worms, which hold, a lot, the nematodes, annelids, and the planarians. And I did tell you with these diagrams that I've been putting in there that I'm adding dissection videos for you to watch, because this is a requirement for biology, is the dissections. And I do still want to somehow get together and do these dissections. I don't know how it's going to be or when they're going to allow us to do that, but they will already be in our journals and all the diagrams. If you study them and have them pre-done, then when we get together, if we are allowed to get together at some point, we could do a couple dissections. One, obviously the worm. You have to dissect an annelid, which we usually do the earthworm. And then in mollusca, the mollusk category, they normally have you do a bivalve, and most of the time it's a clam, and so I put the clam diagram in there, and hopefully you are doing the videos at home to prep up and taking the notes from the categories that I've been sending you. So I've been attaching a lot of extra videos, so that way the lack of our classroom time will you'll have a lot already done, even though we weren't able to do these things in class. And then the Echinodermata, which is the category with the sea stars in there and all of those, cucumbers, urchins, and all that. And then, of course, the sea star being a dissection in biology that you normally do. Now, sometimes they leave out the sea star and leave that just for marine biology, which is going to be a second course underneath the biology category. So we don't really have to do the sea star one. If we do the worm, I think that would be very important for sure. The sea star is really cool, but I did send you a video on that. And did you love that guy and wanting his students to sing the, what is it, the water vascular song? So it made me feel like not such a corny teacher after all, because I don't make you sing songs about anatomy, now do I? I might make you do a little fuzzy crafts or things like that, but, or should I start making you do some songs on anatomy? That's probably something I should consider. Anyway, that was a funny one. So the sea star, and then of course a picture page and left for the test, and then finally into Arthropoda, which Arthropoda is still going to be invertebrates. We're not going to turn to the vertebrate category till next week or next video. And some of my classes are finishing up, and they're not as behind as we were. So I will be able to start making a couple videos a week instead of just one a week. So that'll be nice. So I'm going to try to make the videos catch us up a little bit so we can get through. But another thing that I also said is that I'm doing a very simplified version of our notes and just pretty much one page per category, and then putting a few diagrams in there for you to watch some videos in the Google Classroom so that you can still work on those things, dissections and understanding processes like today with the incomplete metamorphosis. But I'm trying to simplify it because I know we're at the end and everyone's ready to be done, but we do have to get these things in. All right, so arthropods is going to be the last of the main groups that we study of the invertebrates, and then we will turn to the vertebrates, which we will then study the main group in the vertebrates that everybody loves to study, the chordata. And the chordata is where we are classified under, and that'll be the main 5 classes of the chordates will be the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. So those 5 main groups that are fascinating. Well, one thing I do love about this book is it gives so many wonderful pictures and lots of study on diversity among these living organisms. And so I do really appreciate that. I've always loved the Apologia book, and I think it's wonderful, but it just hasn't been updated for so long. So this is why I moved to this book, because it's a more recent edition. And again, with classification, we've talked about this 100 times, it keeps changing. And even with the classification here of the arthropods, the way that they're classifying it is linking up to the formation of the subphyla, and then those subphyla then breaking down beyond that. So even the names are a little different than what of the categories or groupings than when you had older biology books like the Apologia. Okay, so it's always going to be changing, but if we can get a general idea, I'm happy with that. All right, so the arthropods, first of all, they cover the planet. They are the largest and the most significant phylum in kingdom Animalia. And that's hard to take in because the idea of these guys, arthropod, goes with the word jointed leg, and these creatures with these jointed legs. Many times people don't like them. They don't want these little jointed leg creepers all over the place. But the truth is they are very significant. They play a role in so many of the processes of life and sustainment that we don't ever think about. And so like me, as studying this for so long and really appreciating their role, of course I don't like mosquitoes or, nobody likes any of that. But when people are like, spiders, it's always like my children have been raised to know that spiders play a huge role in the ecosystem, and to leave them alone and not they don't like them either. They get a little creeped out. But when you start realizing their impact into our life and how they are created for a special purpose, you can start cohabitating with them, right? We can just live with them and not give them a big fuss. All right, so their main characteristics of Arthropoda. So we have one, they're still going to be in that invertebrate group, and we talked about that, so not having that backbone. Anytime you have an invertebrate, you're going to have some sort of skeleton that has to keep everything in and sturdy, because they do not have that endoskeleton side of things that we see later on. And so that exoskeleton, remember we talked about this with Kingdom Animalia, it could be just the regular, the chitin exoskeleton, that hard, when you think of bugs and they squish and you hear that crunchy, the hydrostatic one that we talked about with like the jellies and stuff. So invertebrates, they're going to not have the backbone to support them, so therefore they have to have something on the outside to support them. And whenever we write characteristics for any of the main phyla, we have to remember these are not every single creature that gets thrown in this category is going to have every one of these. Most of the time they are general characteristics that most of them have. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind too. So invertebrates, and I guess I jumped here to exoskeletons and missed open circulatory system, but the exoskeletons, and like I said, the chitin version of the exoskeletons that you normally hear creates the it's like the organism secretes that new layer, and then it hardens, and then when they are growing they have to molt that off. And so we've seen that with like our cockroaches when we were working with them. So you've seen that molting process of some of the arthropods because of them having that exoskeleton. Now again, some, we have to keep that word in when we're talking about characteristics. All right, so open circulatory system, and now what that means is that when we have a situation where, like, compared to us, okay, so we're vascular creatures, and so we have a closed circulatory system, meaning that our blood is going to be in tubes and constantly moving through in a circle and closed. It doesn't just like flow out and bathe cells for cells to be able to have what they need. But when it comes to an open circulatory system, the hearts that they have, they pump blood through, like, they're still like a vein situation, but it's like short, and it pumps it out, and the blood then bathes the organs in the cavities. So it like kind of shoots it out. Like if you took a human anatomy and physiology last year, that AP class, when we talked about the lymphatic system. If you remember, some of you, the lymphatic system is a bathing system too, like in a sense. It still has its tubes and stuff, but it goes out and then it squeezes back in. And so thinking of it in that terms, so open circulatory system is going to be bathing the organs in the blood so they can get what they need. So all the cells can, take in what they need and excrete what they don't need. All right, so open circulatory system, exoskeletons usually, jointed appendages, and that's where that name comes from, jointed in the beginning, and pods means legs and feet. So they have these jointed parts to their legs and their feet, and you see that, of course, on all these guys in this category. Segmented bodies. So what that means is that their body parts are gonna be broken in categories, like you've seen the traditional 3-section, head, thorax, and abdomen. Or you might have a cephalothorax. That's when the head and the thorax are fused, and then you have the abdomen. So it might be 3-part, it might be 2-part, and then there's even ones that say that in this category, there's some that are just have only one body part, but really it's because of a fusion looking thing. So either way, so this is, most will have these full 2 or 3, but some they do have in here that will just have one, or classified as one. Nervous system. The nervous system, and we talked about this before, when you have the ganglia, a whole bundle of the nerve bodies, then you have them attached to 2 major nerves. So it's not really a real brain, but it acts like a real brain. Like it acts like a brain. So it's not necessarily they have this really great brain like what we would classify as a brain, but it has a system. It's the nerves kind of bundled together, and their major parts of the nerves bundled together with then 2 major nerves that run throughout, and that they're going to have the sensors. Some of the arthropods have the antennae, and they can sense from that. Some senses are even in their feet, in their feet and their legs. They have senses. That's why by, like they say, I think they might say it in our book about flies landing on your hamburger. When they're landing on your hamburger in the picnic time, they're smelling and tasting from their feet because of those senses, sensory things. Sensory, there I go with my words again, right? Okay, so these are going to be general characteristics. Invertebrates, exoskeleton, jointed legs, some with segmented bodies. They've got, their circulatory system. They got a little bit of a nervous system. And then we have what we do then is put them into our boxes like we talked before in the process of classification. So this is where it gets complicated because the classification systems, like I said, depending on where you look, they're rearranging them, it seems like, all the time, or adding subcategories. So it's hard to find like a, just give it to me plainly. Like, is it 5 groups? Is it 4 groups? Is it 8 groups? Just tell me. And most of the time for arthropods, they will put in 5 main groups. And these 5 main groups would be the chylorets, the crustaceans, the insects, the chilopoda, and the diplopoda. The problem with that is prior to this new chylorets group, you would hear this as the arachnids. So if you look this up and say, give me the 5 main groups, and they'd say arachnids, crustaceans, insects, chilopoda, and diplopoda, which centipedes are millipedes. And then you look it up again, and you're like, okay, wait, if you're trying to get 5, I think I wrote in my book like the 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's actually the 5 subphyla, which some of them match, but the subphyla is one subphyla has the trilobites in it, which is pretty much the kind of like an ancient crustacean, which we don't even have on our list here with this particular book. I can't remember if it even talks about it, but I know that's kind of a group that we find in the fossil record that has their own distinct side of things. And so if you go to subphyla, instead of just like groupings, then you've got the trilobite one, you've got this one, you've got crustacean one, and then you have the centis and the millis together in what's called myripoda. Myra means many and poda means legs. So they put these under the subphylum of myripoda. And then they have the hexapoda, which is the whole insect group. So it gets complicated. So what I wanted to do is just say, okay, let's just learn it in a general way. So it's easier to, comprehend and to not get too far. Because there's not going to be many times when you're going to have to sit down there and totally classify all these living organisms, unless you're going to go into biology or zoology, for an actual career. Then you're going to have to really figure this whole thing out. But if you just know the main groups, it helps make more sense of this big group of arthropoda. So we have this, like I said, used to be called the arachnids, the chylorets, and so arachnids are under it, obviously, spiders, mites, ticks, scorpions, whatever. And then now that's even changed, where the scorpions are kind of in a different grouping. And then the horseshoe crabs. Now this sometimes is complicated because when you look at the horseshoe crab, some people will be like, oh, it's not a crab, it's not a crab. It's right, it's not a crab. It's not over in the crustacean true crab category, but it's still an arthropod. So, but they have a different classification, and it has a lot to do with the way the bodies are put together, and each one of these particular guys. And I think our book spends maybe a couple, let me see, like 1, 2, actually 3 pages worth of explaining them. And I think it's because this is confusing, because most of the time people will take arachnids and put them in insects. So they really want to bring this out and say, no, okay, these, no, I'm not saying it chylorets. No, chelicerates. That's what it is, chelicerates. The chelicerates, to really highlight the arachnids as their own group over here away from the insects, and then the horseshoe crab also, so he's not put in crustacean. Okay, so they spend a lot of time on that. But with these guys, they have these little these little claw-like appendages, which they're called, and let me make sure I pronounce it right, chelicera. Okay, there we go. Once I was thinking about the chelicera, I realized I'm not pronouncing this right. So the chelicera is these little claw-like appendages, and they are a little bit different. Of course, crabs have their little pinchers and stuff, but they're a little bit different in their in their design. And so that's what the name, why the name for this particular subphyla. So at first, when you first look, you go, why are the spiders with the horseshoe crabs? Well, because of that Chelicera. So it's used for grabbing and like, like immobilizing the prey and making sure they can't get away. And they illustrate it as like tweezers or tongs. And if you ever dissect, if you get into a more advanced biology course where you actually get to dissect more than the basic ones you normally do, you would see these little guys. And it would make sense why they have their own group. All right, so the arachnids and the horseshoe crabs, because of that Chelicera. Yes, see, I've got to focus when I say words. All right, and then crustaceans. That's a very familiar group. Everybody knows the crustaceans. Crabs, lobsters, barnacles. Not everybody really understands barnacles. That's a good one to look into because you see the barnacles on boats and whales and stuff like that attaching because they are sessile creatures, but you only see the hard part that they're in, and so you don't really realize that there's a little living guy that's down in there. So maybe I'll try to attach a video with crustaceans. Hopefully that will show some good barnacle. Crayfish, krill, shrimp, isopods. Isopods will be kind of the group that will go with the trilobites, but in this category, they didn't bring the trilobites off into its own subphyla. All right, and then insects. Everybody knows the insects, right? Flies, mosquitoes, gnats, termites, stink bugs, bees, ants. You can barely see this over here. I tried to squeeze it in. My book's getting so big. Butterflies, moths, dragonflies, beetles, grasshoppers, crickets, roaches. This is one of the biggest of the groupings under arthropod. And I can't remember if it's the actual group of all living. No, because bacteria would be way more than that. But it definitely under the Arthropoda is going to be the biggest group and the most, there's so much diversity among these creatures. And then there's so much, they are in so big numbers. So, if you have a mosquito, you don't get 3 mosquitoes. You get, 5 million mosquitoes if you are outside in the evening or whatever. So that's where I think they get their huge numbers because of how much they have, right? What's neat about these guys when you're trying to get them put together between keeping arachnids by themselves and then the insects by themselves, and the crustaceans, one good way to remember this is that the insects, most of them have the 3 body parts and they'll have 6 legs. So 6 legs for this category, where the arachnids many times are going to have, and the horseshoe crabs are going to have approximately 8. Okay, so they're going to have the 8 legs, 4 and 4. They're going to have the 6 legs. And then the crustaceans, some of them can have up to 10. So when you start looking at like mounts of legs, that sort of helps you. Okay, are you an arachnid or are you an insect? Looking at the legs to get that. And then, of course, these 2 guys are all about legs too. The Chelopoda and the Diplopoda. Or Chilopoda, Diplopoda, because centipedes, obviously, and then the millipedes. Now, one thing about our book, strangely, doesn't talk at all about centipedes or millipedes. And I was not sure why, because when you study biology, you do all 5, but maybe they just thought there was more, because there's not a lot of diversity among these groups compared to the other groups, so maybe they just spent a lot of time on the other groups, unless I missed it somewhere, which is always possible too. But I put them in there just so we have the 5 main categories for easy for memorization, okay? So if you say, okay, arthropods, I got 5 main groups, I got the insects, and even if you wanted to call this group the arachnids, other than the horseshoe crab and all that, some people still do, so it's fine. So insects, crustaceans, these guys, arachnids or chelicerates, and then the centipedes and the millipedes. All right, now, as the book goes on, they talk a little bit about, obviously, like they always do, reproduction, purpose of the living organisms among the biome and all that. So I didn't want to do, like I said, I'm doing a summed down version. I don't want to do a whole page on, you know, reproduction, all that. You can read that in your book. But I did want to put in the metamorphosis side of things, okay? So these two diagrams up here, and what you can do when you print these out is just color them, you know, so that they don't look terribly boring. And with the metamorphoses, let me see which page that's on, page 346, it will explain the process of what we would consider an incomplete metamorphosis and a complete metamorphosis. Now, the majority of the arthropod group, or well, mainly, I shouldn't say arthropod group, but the insects at least, 90% of the insects undergo the complete version, which is this side. But there's some that only go through a incomplete metamorphosis. So I'm going to attach a video on this so you can take notes around the outside so you can see just the specifics of both of them. But like I said, it does talk about that on page 346. You could also use that page to do this diagram and write all the details. I just didn't want the video to be too long, taking all the notes on something that you probably studied before with incomplete and complete metamorphosis. But I still want you to do that. And then I put this grasshopper, and the reason I did that is because one of the biology things you do is dissect a grasshopper. And so I put this guy on here for you to go ahead and use your book, and I'm going to show you what the book picture looks like. I want you to use your book with markers or color pencils or something to create on this diagram of the grasshopper, create the parts that you would be looking for dissection. Because if you do it over top of them where they're supposed to be, it'll give you a visual from the exterior of the grasshopper into the interior of what you'd be looking for in your dissection. And so if you already have that done and everything labeled and all your parts, then when we dissect the grasshopper, it would be easy and already ready for you, okay? And I thought this way you could take time and color and draw in, and again, just draw them right over top that diagram of the grasshopper, because I want it to be where those things would be taking place, just like our book does. So if you just follow the book, it'd be very easy, and you can just color code it however you want to color code it, like they did, like the dorsal blood vessel is red here, whatever, to help you keep track of it, okay? So that would be something that you could spend some time working on with your diagram. So a video for this one doing the diagram from your book, getting ready for dissection. And then I did leave one picture page. I'm hoping we can still do a dissection and I can get a picture there. And then another one of the dissections that you normally do in the first level biology is the dissection of the crayfish. And so I put a page in here to do the same thing. And let me see if our crayfish, in our book, the crayfish only gives an external diagram. So I gave you an external diagram here to start labeling some of the parts here. And you don't have to label just these, not just 1, 2, 3, 4. You go use the book to put everything in, your mouth, your the abdomen, the carapace, all those sorts of things. And then I'm going to have a video on dissecting this guy too, so that you can use this for practicing and getting all your things labeled out and ready. And then this one is going to be the diagram of its internal components, just like with the grasshopper. Now, sadly, our book doesn't show the internal components, so I'm going to have to put a, hopefully the video, I can't remember if it has any of this. If not, I'll attach a picture of this labeled, hopefully if I can find one in the Google Classroom, and you can just color it in and get it labeled. So this would be getting the crayfish ready for dissection. And is that actually a side of my crayfish? That's actually not. Or is it? He looks kind of funny now all of a sudden on the side. Well, I will check that and make sure. Wait, he doesn't look long enough here from the side version, but I think it is. Yeah, there's his other parts. Okay, so so I'll do that so you can work on that and get that ready. And so that finishes our arthropod, which is chapter 17, I think. And so I'll leave a spot for a quiz, which I think I already know, another picture page in chapter 17 quiz. So I'll glue that one in. Everything's glued in up until this first chapter of Arthropod. I did those last week, and so all I have to do is put the arthropods in, and then we have 2 chapters on the chordots. And so then we'll do the exothermic chordots and the endothermic chordots, and then we'll be done. And so those chapters are a little bit more complex, so I will say they're a little bit longer than these invertebrate chapters. Now, I still want you to be doing your book, or I mean your study guides, and turning those in. You can turn those in through the Google Classroom, or if you are dropping any of your notes off for me to glue into your journal, then you can drop those off, and I will grade those along with getting all the stuff in your journal. Okay, so I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're keeping up. Hope to see you soon.